They came for her in broad daylight with guns, lies, and old grudges. Milville, Georgia was a small place. Not the kind you'd find on postcards, the kind that remembered you by your scars, not your service. And Clara Whitmore had more scars than most. At 70 years old, Clara was still working with oil-stained hands and a Bronze Star medal pinned proudly above her breast. She was a retired Army nurse, a mechanic, a mother, a neighbor. She fixed cars and raised children, some hers and some not, but what she could never fix was the stain a crooked judge had left on her name 40 years ago. Now they were back 2 white officers demanding money, power, and silence. When she refused, they tore down her shop in the night. When she spoke up, they cuffed her like she was nothing. And worst of all, when she was dragged into court, the same judge who destroyed her life decades ago was still sitting on the bench, old bitter, and no less dangerous. But this time, Clara wasn't standing alone. Before we move ahead, let me ask you something. How are you holding up today? Your spirit, all right? Heart steady. Because the story we're about to tell this is about a woman they tried to erase, but she didn't go quietly. She didn't go at all. Milville, Georgia was the kind of town where the past sat heavy on your shoulders. The trees grew tall and slow, the roads cracked in familiar patterns, and everybody knew everybody, or at least thought they did. Secrets in Milville weren't whispered, they were cemented into sidewalks, painted over storefronts, and buried in the soil behind courthouse doors. Clara Whitmore had lived there most of her life. Her small garage sat on the corner of Walnut and Fifth, 2 dusty blocks from downtown next to a Baptist church, and across from what used to be a black-owned bakery, now long shuttered. The garage didn't look like much corrugated metal, citing a faded American flag and hand-painted signs that read Whitmore Auto and Veteran Owned, but inside it was her sanctuary. She had been fixing engines since before some of the town's police had learned to drive. She never charged more than she had to. Teenagers came to learn, elders came to sit, and Clara. She never turned away a soul who came with an honest need. She didn't ask for much, just respect, peace, maybe a quiet afternoon with the radio humming and the wind nudging through the cracked garage window. But in Milville, peace didn't last long. Not for Clara. Not since 1983. Back then, she'd just returned home from her final deployment as an Army nurse. Desert sand still in her boots, a Bronze Star on her chest, a discharge letter that praised her leadership under fire. She was only 33 and still strong enough to carry 3 children on her hip, 2 boys and a baby girl named Nia. She bought the garage with the savings she'd tucked away during service. She had dreams, big ones. Not just about engines and oil pans, but about showing her kids what independence looked like, what dignity meant. But the system had other plans. That year, a man named Judge Richard Malloy accused her of drug trafficking, said she was running pills out the back of her shop, a complete lie built on no evidence, just one shaky testimony from a terrified neighbor who later left town. They took her children, froze her accounts, tried to shut her down. She fought, but back then she had no money for lawyers and no one in power to stand beside her. So she lost. The garage sat empty for 2 years. Her children scattered 2 to foster care, 1 to relatives out of state. Clara cleaned houses, mopped floors at a county hospital, and slowly rebuilt brick by slow, aching brick. When she got the shop back, she hung her medals over the entrance like a warning: I fought for this country, and I'll fight for this corner too. Over time, the whispers faded, people forgot. But Clara never did. She rebuilt her relationship with her children, though it took years. Her sons came around eventually, but it was her daughter, Nia, smart, sharp, always questioning who'd watched her mother with eyes full of fire. Nia left Milville at 18 and didn't look back. College, law school, government work. People didn't know where she ended up, but Clara did. She was proud, quietly, deeply proud. Though they spoke by phone more often than in person, Clara kept every article Nia sent. She framed her daughter's FBI commendation next to her own military medals, service runs in the blood she told her customers. Then just when it seemed like her last years would be peaceful, Denton and Blake came knocking. It started like a bad movie. 2 white officers, matching smirks, flashing badges like they were weapons. They came into her garage mid-afternoon unannounced. Clara had been under the hood of a 2002 Dodge Ram, half covered in sweat and grease. She heard their boots before she saw their faces. Afternoon, Miss Whitmore, said Officer Travis Denton, tall, young, smug. Behind him stood Roy Blake, older, silent, with the flat eyes of someone who'd been doing dirt for too long to flinch. "What can I do for y'all?" Clara asked, wiping her hands on a rag, staying calm. Denton got straight to it. "Town's had a bit of trouble lately. Some break-ins. You've got a good spot here, a lot of tools. Hate for anything to happen. Clara blinked. That a threat? Not at all, he said, just suggesting some, community protection, say $300 a month. Call it a peace fee. Clara laughed, short, cold. This a shakedown. Blake spoke up slow and slick. Call it what you want, but you pay it, your shop stays quiet. Clara folded her arms. I've been threatened by better men than you. Get off my property. They didn't argue, just walked out. 2 days later, her shop was trashed. Tools gone. Windows smashed. The flag outside burned to blackened threads. She called the police. They sent Denton. He wrote down nothing. Next morning, she was arrested. Disorderly conduct, the charge said. Belligerent, disruptive behavior on city property. City property. They claimed she started an altercation in front of town hall. She had witnesses that said otherwise. They weren't asked. At the station, they cuffed her, rough-dragged her through booking, made her sit for 6 hours in a metal chair with no explanation, no lawyer, no phone call. They wanted her to beg. She didn't. She stared dead into the holding cell camera the whole time. Someone saw that footage. Someone with reach. Because when her court date came and she stepped into the courtroom, sore-wristed and tired, she saw the last face she ever wanted to see again. Judge Richard Malloy. Old, grayer, but still wearing that same smug sneer like justice was his to sell. She felt a wave of nausea. He'd done this once. He could do it again. But as she stood there in her coveralls and oil-stained boots, her bronze star still pinned to her left breast, the courtroom doors opened. And in walked a woman in a dark blue suit, heels clicking like gunfire on the tile floor. Sharp cheekbones, military posture, a stare that made the bailiff shift in his seat. Dr. Nia Whitmore, FBI director, and Clara's daughter. She walked straight to the front, turned to the courtroom, and said, "This woman is my mother, and my mother never lied." The courtroom didn't know what to do with itself. Whispers broke out like wind through dry leaves. The town's elderly mayor, sitting in the back row, pulled off his glasses and stared. The county prosecutor swallowed hard. His assistant dropped her pen. And Judge Malloy, once the unshakable law in Milville, gripped the edge of his bench like it might fall out from under him. He cleared his throat. "This is a local matter," he said. "Director Whitmore, I must remind you this is a state." Nia raised one hand, not with arrogance, with precision. "I'm not here to grandstand," she said, "but I will not let my mother be run over again by the same system that stole 40 years of her life. Your Honor, I have evidence, federal-level evidence, that directly pertains to the defendants Denton and Blake and implicates a pattern of corruption involving your courtroom." The room went silent again. Judge Malloy glanced at the bailiff, at the gallery, at the ceiling, anywhere but Nia's eyes. She was her mother's daughter, and in that moment, every ounce of Clara's righteous fire lived behind Nia's still expression. "I'd like to submit the evidence," Nisha continued, stepping forward and handing a sealed envelope to the clerk, along with an immediate request for judicial recusal on the grounds of personal bias, misconduct, and conflict of interest. Judge Malloy started to object, but his voice caught. The envelope was stamped with the seal of the United States Department of Justice. The judge knew what that meant. This wasn't just a show. This was real. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Denton and Blake stood cornered. "Why didn't you tell me her daughter was FBI, Blake?" hissed. Denton looked pale, sweating through his collar. She never mentioned it. Blake snarled, "God help us." But help wasn't coming. Because inside that courtroom, Nia Whitmore had laid down the receipts. The recordings came from an undercover contact who had grown suspicious of Denton's sudden spending habits and confided in a regional FBI task force. Clear as day, the audio played. Denton. "That old lady got a shop full of tools, cash business. Nobody's gonna miss a few hundred a month, Blake. She don't pay. We break some windows. Hell, I'll plant something if we have to." There was more. Security footage from across the street, grainy, time-stamped, but clear enough to show Denton walking around the back of Clara's garage the night before the vandalism. A financial trail of strange deposits into both officers' bank accounts, small amounts, but regular, consistent with extortion. Then came the kicker, an affidavit from a former officer now living in Atlanta who claimed Denton and Blake had cleaned out a Latino-owned auto body shop in a nearby town 3 years prior, same tactic, same threats, same results. This wasn't a one-time shakedown. It was a pattern, a business. And they'd picked the wrong woman this time. The judge called for a recess, but the room refused to relax. Reporters had arrived. People whispered Clara's name with reverence now. That's when another voice broke the air. Older hire trembled with the weight of time. "I have something to say." All heads turned toward the back. Lucille Green, 80 years old, cane in hand, eyes burning with tears, stood and shuffled slowly toward the front. "I've been silent too long," she said. The judge started to protest. "Miss Green." She raised her hand and silenced him. "I know the rules. I was a court clerk in '83. I was there the day you destroyed Clara. And I lied. Because you made me." Gasps spread across the gallery. Malloy's eyes widened. "You said if I didn't testify she was hiding drugs, you'd ruin my son's college chances, so I lied. I cried, but I lied." She looked over at Clara, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry. I thought if I stayed quiet I could live with it. But I never lived a day in peace. Not one." Clara, seated in the front, simply nodded once. "I forgive you," she said. That was it. That was all. But it cracked something open. One by one, people began to rise. "I saw those boys around Clara's shop last week. I didn't say anything. He pulled me over last year and searched my car for nothing. They threatened my nephew. I didn't know what to do. I've been afraid of that judge my whole life." The gallery had become a confession hall. The silence of Milville, the long, bitter silence that had protected white power and punished black truth, was breaking, shattering, falling to dust. The courtroom could barely contain it. Someone clapped, then another, then a full wave of applause crashed through the chambers. Malloy stood up, red-faced, shouting for order. But no one was listening. The bailiff looked over at Nia, unsure what to do. And Clara, she just sat there, watching, as the lies burned around her. Within the hour, the courtroom was sealed off. Federal marshals entered. Malloy was served on the spot indictment papers for judicial misconduct, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Denton and Blake were escorted out in cuffs, trying to hide their faces as cameras flashed. The same cameras that once watched Clara taken away in shame now captured her sitting still, proud, resolute. By the end of the day, Nia and Clara walked out of the courthouse together, arm in arm. The sun broke through the clouds like it had been waiting. The crowd outside, neighbors, veterans, local leaders chanted Clara's name. "Clara, Clara, Clara." She turned to face them, not with a speech, not with tears, just a quiet, sharp salute. Bronze star gleaming, wrists still marked with red from the cuffs. But her back was straight, her name clean. After decades of being treated like a footnote in her own life, Clara Whitmore was now the center of a movement. But justice wasn't finished. Not yet. The arrest of Judge Richard Malloy and officers Denton and Blake had sent shockwaves across Georgia, especially in small towns like Milville, where justice often moves slow sideways or not at all. Within 48 hours, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched a full-scale probe into the Milville Police Department. Officers who had once looked the other way found themselves called in for questioning. Suddenly, people who had power in Milville were running scared. Yet even in victory, Clara remained grounded. The morning after the courtroom uprising, she returned to her garage. The windows were still shattered, her tools half gone, graffiti still smeared on one of the walls. Bitch and red spray paint faded but visible. She stood in the doorway for a full 5 minutes just staring, not sad, not angry, just quiet. Then she picked up a broom and began to sweep. She didn't wait for a camera crew, didn't post a photo, just swept the dust and the lies and the fear out of her shop like it was any other Thursday morning. That's when she heard a car pull up. She didn't look, but a voice called from behind her, "You always clean your own mess, Mama." She turned. Nia stood there in jeans and a gray t-shirt, no badge, no blazer. Just her daughter, strong, successful, and standing on Clara's land. "I didn't make this mess," Clara replied, "but it's still mine to clean." Nia stepped forward, took a second broom from the wall, and began sweeping too. For the first time in decades, mother and daughter worked side by side, not in survival, but in restoration. Later that day, the news broke nationally. CNN, MSNBC, The Root. Even Fox tried to spin it, but the facts were too damning to twist. FBI Director Nia Whitmore exposes corruption in hometown courtroom. Veteran mechanics' courage sparks Southern judicial reckoning. Black woman 70 brings down crooked judge who stole her children. Suddenly, Clara's name was trending. But in Milville, the real turning point wasn't on cable. It happened at dusk. As the sun fell behind the trees, Clara's front yard filled up. First, it was Lucille Green and her granddaughter bringing a warm casserole and a fresh apology. Then came Pastor Darrell from First Missionary Baptists with 2 deacons and some folding chairs. Then a pair of neighborhood kids Clara had once taught to change tires. They brought flowers and a hand-drawn thank you note that read, "You never lied." By nightfall, there were nearly 50 people gathered outside her home. Some sat, some stood, some simply came to be near the place where truth had finally stood its ground. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't a rally. It was a homecoming. People who had kept their heads down for years now lifted their chins. People who had once crossed the street when they saw Clara now brought plates of food and soft embraces. Someone started humming a hymn. An old voice joined in, then another, then another. And Clara. She sat on her porch in a folding chair, a glass of sweet tea in one hand, and a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in 40 years. Not pride, not revenge, but release. But the system Clara had exposed wasn't going quietly. Back in Atlanta, lawyers from Malloy began filing motions claiming the judge was confused, pressured, framed. News pundits tried to stir doubt. Why now, they asked. Why would this woman stay silent all these years and speak out only after her daughter became powerful? Clara didn't answer them, but Nia did. In a televised interview on PBS, Nia said, "My mother didn't stay silent. She was silenced, and there's a difference. She didn't speak out now because I'm powerful. She spoke out now because for the first time, someone in power finally listened." That quote went viral. Across the country, Black women, young and old, posted photos of themselves with their mothers under the hashtag #MyMotherNeverLied. It wasn't just support. It was solidarity. Clara began receiving letters from women in Detroit and Jackson and Baltimore and rural towns with names even smaller than Milville. Letters like, "They took my kids too. I fought but nobody cared. Your story made me feel human again." Or, "I watched that judge look you in the eye and not flinch. And then I watched you outlast him." That's power. Then came the call from the Department of Justice. A special prosecutor was assigned to Milville and a broader corruption investigation launched. More officers came forward, some ashamed, some angry, all afraid. Clara didn't testify again. She didn't need to. She had done her part. She had been the flint. Now the spark was catching fire. But the most unexpected moment came on a Sunday afternoon. The same courtroom where she had once been sentenced now held a ceremony. The mayor, an old man who'd once looked the other way, presented Clara with the key to the city. But Clara didn't stand for pomp. When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the podium and said, "Y'all know what happened? I don't need to relive it. But let me tell you what I learned. I learned you can take a woman's name, her money, her children, but you can't take her truth. And if you hold on to that truth long enough, somebody somewhere will see it. And when they do, Lord help the ones who tried to bury it." Applause thundered. Some wept. Some shouted, "Amen!" And others, once skeptics, nodded slowly, because now they believed her. That day didn't just mark Clara's return. It marked Milville's reckoning. The town had turned a corner it couldn't unturn. And Clara, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She demanded remembrance. And she got it. 6 weeks after the courtroom uprising, Clara Whitmore sat once again on the wooden bench outside her garage. The place was patched up, new windows, new coat of paint, and a new sign gifted by the local NAACP chapter. Clara's garage built on service, rebuilt with truth. Inside, the smell of motor oil and fresh rubber had returned. So had the customers. But Clara knew the real fix wasn't in the wrenches or wheels. The repair had happened in the people. And yet the biggest day was still ahead. Because federal court had set a public trial date for Judge Richard Malloy to answer for judicial misconduct, perjury, and conspiracy. It would be the first such case in Georgia in nearly 70 years. And Clara was scheduled to appear as the star witness. Nia didn't pressure her. "You don't have to do this," she'd said. "You've already won in the court of public opinion." But Clara wasn't interested in public opinion. She was interested in record. "I'll testify," she said, "because I need to say it where it counts." The courtroom this time wasn't the small, musty room in Milville. This was a federal court building in Atlanta. Cameras were allowed outside, but not in. Reporters packed the sidewalks, and legal analysts circled the docket like bees around a busted hive. Inside the courtroom was crisp, modern, cold with steel and judgment, the kind of place built to look like fairness even when it hadn't always delivered it. Clara wore a dark blue suit, no overalls, no grease, but the bronze star still pinned on her chest. Malloy sat behind the defense table, no robe now. Just a frail older man in a charcoal suit flanked by lawyers who looked like they were calculating how much reputation they could save, if any. When Clara took the stand, the room fell into a hush. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She testified. "I served in Iraq in '91. Saw men's lives hanging by threads. Patched them up under mortar fire. I did my duty. Came home with a medal. And y'all treated me like I was poison." The prosecutor guided her gently. And what happened in 1983, Clara recounted the false testimony, the loss of her kids, the garage stripped, the silence that followed. "He took more than my freedom," she said, nodding toward Malloy. "He took my voice. He made me ashamed of the truth. But I stand here today, still here because shame can't hold forever. Truth waits. And when it speaks, you better listen. Then came the cross-examination. Malloy's defense tried to discredit her. You're telling us that for 40 years you had no means to clear your name. Clara didn't blink. I had the truth the whole time. Y'all just wouldn't let it in the room. The gallery murmured. The judge banged his gavel for order. Then came the final blow. Nia was called not as director of the FBI, but as Clara's daughter and an official agent in charge of the corruption investigation. Her voice was precise, her presence undeniable. She laid out the federal findings Malloy had coordinated with Denton and Blake in at least 3 known incidents over 10 years. Evidence tampering, witness coercion, and illegal property seizures. Several files had gone missing. One had a falsified signature. That signature had been traced by forensic ink analysis back to Malloy himself. There was no wiggle room, no gray area, only guilt. By the end of the testimony, even the defense lawyers looked like they were bracing for impact. Then came Lucille Green, the woman who had once testified falsely against Clara and now stood to correct her own history. 80 years old, dressed in Sunday white. She looked Malloy in the eye and said, "I lied because I was afraid of you, but now you're the one on trial. And I ain't afraid no more." The courtroom erupted. It took the judge 5 full minutes to bring it back under control. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, a black woman in her 60s, read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. Gasps, cheers, tears. Clara sat still, not stunned, not smug, just still. Nia reached over, took her hand, and gave it a quiet squeeze. Judge Malloy was taken out in handcuffs. Reporters tried to swarm, but U.S. Marshals held the line. Outside, the crowd had grown. Hundreds now. Some carried signs, "Justice for Clara." Some wore t-shirts with her face and the words, "My mother never lied." Some just stood in silence, tears tracking down weathered cheeks. When Clara emerged, the applause didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like redemption. Later that evening, at a community gathering organized by the Georgia Women's Legal Defense League, Clara was honored not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a witness. The keynote speaker, a black female judge from Savannah, put it simply. She didn't just speak, she endured, and in doing so, she lit a path for all of us. Clara stood to speak, microphone in hand. They tried to make me disappear, tried to turn me into a cautionary tale. But I'm still here. My wrists may have carried cuffs, but my soul stayed free. She looked out at the young women in the crowd. Her voice deepened. Let them lie, let them threaten, let them run the clock for years, but don't let them win. Your truth is not your shame. It's your sword. Another standing ovation. When Clara returned to Milville the next day, the road to her garage had been unofficially renamed by a group of high school students. They hung a homemade sign that read, "Whitmore Way." She laughed when she saw it. "You better tell the county they owe me a street sign," she joked. But even without official paperwork, the truth was undeniable. The street that had once led to silence now led to legacy. Clara Whitmore never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted her peace. But symbols are rarely self-made. They are carved from pain, polished by perseverance, and lifted by people finally ready to see what was always there. Weeks after the federal trial, life in Milville began to shift. The police department underwent a full restructuring. Half the officers were replaced. New policies were adopted: body cams, community liaisons, monthly town hall check-ins. And for the first time in the town's 150-year history, a black woman was appointed as chief of police. Her name was Carla Eubanks, a no-nonsense, straight-talking mother of 2 who walked the beat before she wore the bars. And on her first day in office, she stopped by Clara's garage with a bouquet of white lilies and said, "We owe you, all of us." Clara didn't tear up. She just nodded, took the flowers, and placed them next to her bronze star in the window. But it wasn't just about institutions. The people were changing too. The old bakery reopened, now a co-op run by local women. Young men who once ran the streets came asking Clara for work grease under their nails, heads hung low, ready to learn. And every Saturday morning, without fail, a line formed outside her garage, not for car repairs, but for wisdom. She called it the Circle. Men, women, teens, black, brown, and even a few white folk came and sat on folding chairs. Sometimes she spoke about dignity, sometimes about war. Sometimes she just listened. And that was enough. One Saturday, she invited Lucille Green to speak. Lucille hobbled up, eyes cloudy but voice sharp. "You can't fix what you won't face," she said. "And I faced my shame because Clara faced hers every day. If y'all walk away with anything, let it be that." They called her Mother Lucille after that. Meanwhile, Nia found herself pulled in every direction. After the trial, President Harmon requested a private meeting. Sitting in the Oval Office, she was asked, "What made your mother finally speak up after all those years?" Nia thought for a moment. Then she said, "She never stopped speaking. We just weren't listening loud enough." The president smiled. "Let's make sure we hear others like her." And so Nia did something unexpected. She stepped back. Not retired, but shifted roles, returning to Georgia to open a civilian oversight office for rural police departments, starting with Milville. She moved into a modest house 3 blocks from her mother's. And for the first time since she was a teenager, she sat at her mama's kitchen table on Tuesday nights, eating fried catfish and telling stories. Clara would act like she wasn't listening, but her smile always gave her away. That fall, the Georgia State Assembly held a special legislative session. At its close, a resolution passed unanimously, Democrats and Republicans alike. The state officially recognized the Whitmore Correction Act, a package of reforms addressing judicial misconduct, civilian protection during traffic stops, and review protocols for long-standing wrongful convictions. When Clara was invited to speak before the assembly, she wore her Army blues, the same ones they once tried to forget. She stood at the podium and said, "I was never against law and order. I just wanted the law to apply to me like it applied to everybody else." No applause. Just long silent nods. The kind that say, "We hear you now." At home, Clara's garage became a landmark. Journalists visited, tourists even passed through, some asking for selfies. Clara rarely agreed. But every now and then, when the light was just right and her hands weren't full of carburetor parts, she'd stand beneath the new sign that read, "Clara Whitmore's Freedom Shop." And she'd allow one photo. Only if they didn't filter it. "I earned every wrinkle," she said. In December, the town threw her a 71st birthday celebration in the church fellowship hall. Old friends, new allies, little kids too young to know what the big fuss was about. But they danced anyway. They wore pins with Clara's face on them. T-shirts that read, "I stand with Clara." Even the mayor tried to cut a rug. And when Clara was asked to make a toast, she raised her glass of iced tea and said, "To second chances, and to the folks who don't give up on the first." But perhaps the most telling moment came quietly one Sunday evening as the sky dimmed. Clara sat on her porch alone. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and honeysuckle. Her dog Rudy slept beside her. And from a few blocks away, she could hear the laughter of children, black-white mixed riding bikes on the street she helped reclaim. She closed her eyes. No cameras, no crowds. Just her breath. And a whisper barely spoken. "I'm still here." That was Clara's curtain call. Not in headlines, but in wholeness. When a tree falls in the woods, people wonder if anyone heard it. But when Clara Whitmore stood up, the echo didn't stop. It kept ringing through courthouses, classrooms, neighborhoods, and Sunday sermons. Her name became something more than a headline. It became a lesson. Milville, Georgia became something more too. The town that once turned its back on her now built benches in her honor. Students painted murals on the school walls, one of Clara in her Army uniform, another of her handing a wrench to a young girl in overalls. Above it in bold white paint were the words, "Don't silence the truth, fix the system." But the echoes went far beyond Milville. Letters began arriving at Clara's garage from across the country. From New Orleans. "I've been a public defender for 22 years. Your case gave me the fuel to reopen 2 closed files." From Pittsburgh. "My grandmother lost her nursing license because of a racist judge. I never knew how to fight back until I heard your story." From Sacramento. "My mom and I didn't talk for years, but watching you and Nia walk out of that courtroom together, it made me call her. Thank you." Clara read everyone. She didn't always reply, but she always read them. And late at night, when the world was quiet, she'd whisper the names of the women who wrote in, like a prayer. Meanwhile, the Whitmore Correction Act gained traction in neighboring states. Civil rights lawyers used Clara's testimony in legislative hearings from Florida to Missouri. Some started calling it the Whitmore Doctrine, the principle that justice delayed by power imbalance is not justice denied but justice pending. Clara chuckled when she heard that. "I'm just a woman with a wrench," she said. But even she knew this was bigger than her now. One year after the trial, a film crew from PBS arrived to do a feature. The segment was called Truth in Time, the Clara Whitmore Story. The interviewer was a black woman in her 40s who couldn't hide her awe. "You've become a national figure," she said, setting up the mic. Clara adjusted her jacket. "I didn't ask to be." "But you are. What do you want people to learn from all this?" Clara thought for a second, then answered, "That you can survive and still be angry. That you can forgive and still demand justice. And that silence is never safe, it's just delayed storm." The interviewer paused, stunned. "That's the most powerful thing I've heard all week." Clara gave a half smile. Keep listening. You'll hear more. Back in Milville, the Circle, her Saturday morning gathering grew from a few folks in folding chairs to full-on sessions. They moved it to the rec center. Local newspapers began publishing Clara's Corner, a monthly advice column where she shared hard-earned truths about life work and survival. Sample entry. Dear Clara, they passed me over for a promotion again. What should I do? Tired in Tifton. Dear Tired. Get so good they can't ignore you next time. And if they still do build your own table, I did mine smells like diesel and truth. Clara. But one echo was louder than all the others. Nia. Though she'd stepped back from her national post, her name still carried weight in every law enforcement reform circle in the country. She was offered TV spots, book deals, even a Senate endorsement. She turned them all down. I'm not interested in being a politician, she told one reporter. I'm interested in repairing what they broke. Her greatest joy now came from small moments mentoring young black girls in the county guest lecturing at Georgia State, and on Sundays, sitting beside her mother at church. After service, they'd walk down Main Street arm in arm. People waved, some cried, others simply nodded as if to say, "We see you now." Then came the unexpected invitation. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. reached out. They wanted to induct Clara's story into their permanent exhibit on Black women in service and struggle. They asked for a uniform, her wrench, and if she agreed, the Bronze Star. She sent all three, but she added a note now displayed beneath the items in elegant script. I wore this for my country. I carried this for my community. I earned this for surviving the war at home. Signed, Clara Whitmore. The day the exhibit opened, Nia flew Clara to D.C. for the first time in decades. As they walked through the halls of the museum, passing walls lined with stories and faces, Clara stopped at her own. She stared at her uniform, at her medal, at the wrench still stained with oil. She whispered, I almost didn't make it here. Nia placed a hand on her back. But you did, Mama, you did. And perhaps the most telling echo of all, a little girl named Brielle, age 9, who visited the exhibit with her school group and saw Clara's name under the glass. When the teacher asked what she'd learned that day, Brielle said that some heroes don't wear capes. They wear coveralls and fix the truth. Clara Whitmore never asked to be a movement. She just asked to be seen. Not as a threat, not as a case file, not as a woman with a past, but as a veteran, a mother, a mechanic, a truth bearer. They tried to erase her. First with lies, then with silence, then with time. But time didn't erase her. Time revealed her. And now her story lives, not just in museum walls or courtroom transcripts, but in the hearts of every person who ever dared to stand up and say no more. This story is about a woman, yes, but it's also about a system. A small town that learned too late what happens when you let corruption grow roots. A courtroom where a robe became a weapon, a badge used not for protection but for profit. And yet it's also about what happens when one voice refuses to die out. Clara's story teaches us that truth is patient, but it's never passive. It waits for its time. And when that time comes, it doesn't whisper, it roars. So if you're reading this, ask yourself, who in your town has been silenced? Who's still fighting the battles no one sees? Whose truth are you ignoring because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable? Because the Clara Whitmores of the world are everywhere. They're sitting in courtrooms, repairing cars, raising kids, bearing medals with no one clapping. They're not gone. They're just waiting for someone to say, I believe you. You can be that someone. So here's what I ask. Believe Black women. Share their stories. Challenge the systems that bury them. If Clara's story moved, you don't let it end here. Like this story to help it reach more people. Comment if you know a woman who reminds you of Clara. Share this with someone who needs to know what justice really looks like. Subscribe to the Black Women channel, where we protect the truth, praise the courage, and preserve the legacy. Clara's not just a name. She's a reminder, and reminders like her, they don't fade, they rise.